The Not So Perfect Pair by starcollectorsilas. Chapter 13. Chuya stared unblinkingly at the message on the screen and his hurried response. "Good night, darling. Sleep well." His face burned as he sat in his bed, reading over the message again and again. "Good night, darling. Sleep well." Fuck. He's fucked. He has his first crush in months. He has a crush, and it's on his insufferable asshole of a best friend. His insufferable best friend, who isn't his soulmate, who doesn't like him, who is helping him find his actual soulmate. His best friend, who is just teasing him. It took Chuya longer than usual to fall asleep. The first thing Chuya felt when he woke up was pain. By now he was used to waking up with tingling arms and legs, and he had quickly stopped trying to keep track of the forest of injuries on his body, only taking note of the particularly severe ones. But this was different. It felt like the insides of his forearms were burning, or like there was air trapped under his skin. The long, deep blue lines up the insides of his arms were the most alarming things he'd seen in his life. He could feel the back of his head mildly throbbing, and the pain in his wrist from where he assumed his soulmate had sprained it was also there, but drowned out by the pain and irritation from the gashes along his forearm. Usually there would be a little struggle for him to force himself out of the comfort of his bed, but it was like he had been woken up to a bucket of freezing water poured over his head. Only it was boiling water and poured over his forearms. He sat bolt upright quickly, grabbing onto his arms in an attempt to stop the pain, but he only had time to let out a strangled gasp of pain before it was dying down. It faded rapidly, the burning sensation ebbing into an itchy one, prickling up the entirety of his inner arms. Still, the memory of the pain lingered, a dull throbbing in the back of his skull. He didn't let himself think about it, throwing himself out of his bed and into his uniform, throwing on his hoodie like he had been every other day, still hiding the marks from his parents and siblings. He didn't bother brushing his teeth or grabbing anything to eat. He had thankfully prepared his lunch the night before, so he shoved it in his bag haphazardly as he rushed out the door, apologizing loudly when he barreled into Koyo in the hallway. "Slow down, jackass!" she shouted indignantly, but Chuya was already out the front door. He stopped short as his eyes fell on the spot where Dazai normally waited for him. It was empty. He frowned and slowed down, slinging his bag over his shoulder as he walked the rest of the way, staring at the lamppost Dazai normally stood at as though it had personally offended him. After a moment, he pulled his phone out, checking the time. 8:39. If anything, Chuya was late. They normally got to school early to go and bother the library staff, or visit the few teachers that could stand them, or just hang out with their friends. School started at 9, so they'd get there at least 10 minutes early, and they normally left at 8:30. So he was late, and Dazai was even later, apparently. Behind him, his front door opened and Kyoka came out, her hair in a half-up style, a ribbon tied in her hair. She stopped when she got to him and looked puzzled. "Dazai isn't here?" she asked, and Chuya nodded. "Yeah, he didn't message me to say he was gonna be late either." Kyoka hummed, then blinked, seeming to spot something over Chuya's shoulder. "That sucks," she said, and she promptly turned around to start walking to school herself. Chuya looked after her, slightly bewildered, taken aback. Then he sensed a presence behind him, and he turned around, taking in the sight of an exhausted Dazai. He looked like shit, paler than usual, dark eye bags and messy hair, like he had forced himself to even get out of his bed that morning. Still, Dazai put on the biggest smile possible and greeted him easily. "Chuya! Short as ever, I see. I almost missed you standing there," Dazai said teasingly. Chuya frowned, too caught up with the sight of Dazai, who looked off. "I'm only 16. I'm still growing," he said absently, defaulting to his usual response, more focused on trying to figure out what was wrong. Dazai didn't say anything about Chuya's lack of enthusiasm, just beginning to walk and letting him fall into step beside him. Chuya looked at the ground, kicking a rock as he walked. The sky was gray and overcast, a threat of rain on the horizon. He was caught up in his thoughts, raising a hand to his mouth to bite at his thumb while he thought. Something was clearly wrong with Dazai. There was also something wrong with his soulmate. He honestly felt pretty shit himself, with his new realization from the previous night. One that he had forgotten about, and he felt his cheeks heat up as he promptly remembered about his unfortunate crush on the loser walking next to him. Seriously, of all people to like? He could have had a crush on Rampo or Kunikida or generally anybody else, and it just had to be Dazai? His best friend since primary, the know-it-all who had taught him how to tie his shoelaces, the weirdo who hadn't had any clue who Taylor Swift was, the asshole who stole his t-shirts all the time, the kid who had calmly announced to Chuya and his parents that he had a fractured elbow after being pushed off a slide. Why? That was the only thing he could ask himself. Why? It was so stupid. After everything he had always said about never wanting to have anything romantic with a mackerel bastard. Fuck. He was interrupted by Dazai taking his wrist and pulling his hand away from his mouth, having noticed Chuya biting his nail. Dazai's hand then slid from his wrist to intertwine with his own, Chuya's right hand in Dazai's left. Chuya's face went bright red at the contact. He groaned internally, furious with himself. You do this like every other day. Why the fuck are you making a big deal of it now? He stole a quick glance at Dazai, who seemed unbothered. Actually, Dazai didn't seem to be paying any attention to anything going on. He was just looking at the ground with a far-off look in his eyes, like he wasn't fully present. Again, this was getting far too common for Chuya's liking. So, to try and bring Dazai back, he cleared his throat and squeezed Dazai's hand, feeling relieved when Dazai blinked and looked over at him. Yeah? Dazai asked, tilting his head like he hadn't just been practically in another universe. Chuya swallowed, scraping his brain for a topic. There's new marks from my soulmate, was what he blurted out, internally cursing himself. That was not the topic he had wanted to talk about. Dazai tensed up a bit, and then nodded. Describe them, Dazai said, sounding tired. Chuya felt guilty for bringing it up. Dazai was clearly not in the mood to be talking about anything, never mind something like this. Chuya took a deep breath anyway, squashing his guilt and thinking back to what he had seen that morning. Long, deep, I think. The most noticeable were two, right up in the middle of my inner arm. I didn't check anywhere else. It had really hurt when I woke up. It doesn't hurt anymore, thankfully. That was a lie. His arm still hurt, a dull throbbing present, though it wasn't quite painful if he thought about it, just uncomfortable. He didn't know how else to describe it. Dazai looked away, seemingly interested in the displays in the windows of the shops they passed. Attempted suicide, Dazai said, tone carefully blank. Instantly, Chuya felt sick, like he might throw up any second. Attempted? He asked quietly. Dazai just nodded, returning to look at the ground. Chuya wanted to prod, to ask how he knew, how he was certain it didn't work, what he should do now. Maybe now was the point where he should tell more adults. This was bad. Suicide? How was he supposed to deal with that? Though, if telling an adult would do anything, Mr. Fukuzawa would have fixed it. Telling an adult would just worry them. Oh, was all Chuya said after that, and they continued the rest of the walk to school in silence. Throughout the day, Chuya could have sworn Dazai was getting increasingly agitated and distant. Even small accidents that Dazai normally wouldn't care about were getting to him. Of course, Chuya was also fairly pissed off. His arms hurt. He was worried for his soulmate. He was tired, and on top of everything, Dazai was acting weird. But Dazai was worse, and Dazai continued to get worse. The first time he noticed something was wrong was when Dazai's favorite spot in the corner of the library was occupied when they got there in the morning. Dazai hadn't said anything, only turning away and dragging Chuya outside over to their usual lunch spot. The next time he had noticed, it was at the end of their second period class, when, after spacing out for the entirety of the first 2 lessons, they had been packing up their stuff and someone threw a piece of paper across the classroom. It had not been intended to hit Dazai, but it did anyway, and Dazai seemed unreasonably upset, and threw it back twice as hard. Obviously it was paper, so it barely hurt the kid he threw it at, but that teacher already had a grudge against Dazai for some reason, and only Dazai got told off. Chuya had stood waiting outside the classroom while Dazai got told off once the class had ended, and Dazai hadn't even looked at him before storming off. They had spent break in the music room, and Dazai had pressed firmly into Chuya's side with his eyes closed and headphones on, while Chuya tried not to die or overheat from embarrassment. After break, during third period, Dazai had accidentally knocked over a water pot on one of the smaller sketches for his art portfolio. He had hit the table in frustration, and Chuya had been able to see the tears in his eyes from the opposite side of the table. Hitting the table had only made it worse, the spilt water dripping off the edge of the table onto the legs of Dazai's trousers, and Dazai had looked about 2 seconds away from throwing himself off of a roof. A few minutes into fourth period, and Dazai's headphones died, and he had just dropped them on the table with a loud bang, covered his ears and put his head on his knees, ignoring the entire class. Their PE class had gotten switched last minute to be fifth period that day, and Dazai, who had been looking forward to the opportunity to lock himself in an empty practice room and charge his headphones during music, seems genuinely distraught. As a result of the class being changed last minute, nobody had their change of clothes, so everyone was in their uniform, and Dazai had been told off for not removing his hoodie, been forced to, and despite his, by this point, rather desperate pleas to be exempt and sit at the side, if not leave, he was forced to participate. While participating in dodgeball, a game Dazai was really good at, he got hit with multiple balls, refused to lift his arms to even attempt to catch any, and seemed to be in extreme pain anytime someone bumped into the sides of his arms. Eventually, when Dazai had made it beyond clear he wasn't going to participate, and he had sent his 100th dirty look at the PE teacher, he had been allowed to leave for lunch early, and Chuya had to go with him. What was truly confusing, though, was the total 360 switch Dazai had made the second that their friends had started trickling into the library, taking their seats on the floor in the corner they were quite comfortably inhabiting. Dazai's headphones had been given to Kunikida, who had a charger and battery pack, and while Dazai had spent the extra few minutes before lunch properly started practically hiding behind Chuya, he was now talking animatedly, waving his hands around. Chuya was half asleep, but still watching with amusement, listening to Dazai boast about his athletic capabilities. And while I was in PE today, you should have seen it, dodging left and right, not getting hit once. Apart from when I wanted to, of course, have to make it fair somehow. Dazai said proudly, eliciting a few oohs from Atsushi and Akutagawa, who were listening eagerly. Chuya raised an eyebrow, squinting at Dazai. That was very obviously not what had happened. Quite the opposite, actually. But he didn't speak up, letting Dazai lie until his heart was content. Chuya had already eaten his lunch, a box empty aside from the food he had packed for Dazai, which had been turned down quickly. With the current state Dazai was in, the last thing Chuya was going to do was pressure him to eat if he had said he didn't want to. His lunchbox was still open and in front of him, however, and as Dazai continued his exaggerated boasts and storytelling, Kunikida looked up from where he was talking with Yosano, their conversation hushed and rather giggly. When Kunikida noticed the untouched sandwich in the box, it barely took him any time to realize who the sandwich was supposed to belong to. "Dazai, have you eaten?" Kunikida asked, and Chuya sat up slightly straighter, prepared to explain to Kunikida to say it was okay, that he'd try and convince Dazai to eat later, that it had been a bad day and pushing Dazai to eat might not help. Dazai answered instead, waving his hand dismissively, but there was a tension to his shoulders that he had dropped temporarily. I'm not hungry. Dazai stood up quickly after that, talking loudly. You'll never guess what one of the members of the theater department taught me to do. Juggle! He said, and instantly 2 apples and an orange were being shoved into his hands, the apples from Rampo and Akutagawa, and the orange from Atsushi. Chuya groaned and rolled his eyes, but he looked up at Dazai standing in the center of the circle they were all sat in as Dazai accepted the fruits gratefully. Thank you, kind sirs, thank you, Dazai said with an exaggerated bow, straightening up again and clearing his throat. To my dearest Nikolai from the drama department, you're a real one. I hope you can sense this message from wherever you are now. Dazai continued, closing his eyes and putting on a sorrowful expression. Chuya scoffed and rolled his eyes. He had suspected it was Nikolai, the kid who dressed like a clown half the time and hung around the smart Russian kid who fainted at least once every summer. Knowing Nikolai, he was probably making out with said Russian kid in the back of the auditorium somehow, and he probably could sense every time someone started juggling in the nearby vicinity. What was Dazai doing calling Nikolai dearest anyway? Surely they weren't that good friends. Nikolai has a boyfriend. Unimpeded by the unintentional glare Chuya was sending in his direction, Dazai threw the first apple in the air and quickly followed it up with the orange, and then the other apple, actually managing to juggle the fruit, even if he was a little shaky. Rampo was laughing his ass off and recording, while Atsushi and Akutagawa were watching with wide eyes. The way those two idolized Dazai was actually kinda depressing. Chuya, though he wouldn't admit it, was actually kind of impressed. That must have taken a while to learn. It took a lot of concentration, probably. Lots of practice and patience. Dazai was really talented and pretty. Even though it was pouring down with rain outside, the gray light coming through the window was making him look stunning. His eyes were wide as he focused on the makeshift balls he was throwing, and his mouth was slightly open, his lips red from being bitten all day. When he felt his cheeks redden slightly at the thought, he made the split decision to create a distraction, and he suddenly pushed himself forward, slapping Dazai as hard as he could on the ass, causing him to yelp in surprise and jump about a foot in the air. Instantly, Chuya started cackling, and Rampo, who had been laughing already and managed to catch it on camera, started to laugh even harder. Dazai panicked and scrambled to catch the fruits, falling to the floor clumsily, somehow managing to catch the dropped fruits, but ending up laying on his back on the floor and panting. How the hell did Chuya ever think he had a crush on this dumbass? Jesus Christ, he needs to get his brain checked, because this is just embarrassing. After a moment, Dazai sat bolt upright, his face bright red. Chuya! He shouted accusingly, his eyes trained on Chuya, who was laughing so hard he couldn't breathe properly. That was incredible! You should have seen your face! Chuya wheezed out, wiping tears from his eyes. At the sight of Chuya laughing so hard, Dazai was fighting back his own smile, trying to look pissed off. Anger or irritation was not an expression Chuya was used to seeing on Dazai's face, and that just made it even funnier, but he forced himself to take a deep breath, his cheeks hurting from smiling. Did that scare you? Chuya asked, trying to stifle his laughs. Dazai, who was giving the fruit back to their rightful owners, wrinkled his nose. No, I just wasn't expecting to have my ass assaulted while I was in school, while juggling no less, Dazai said haughtily, moving back to where he had been sitting next to Chuya. While they had just been laughing and joking, it was like a switch had flipped and suddenly Dazai looked exhausted again, trying to joke and hide it while leaning on Chuya's shoulder. Chuya sighed and shook his head, calming himself down, trying to remind himself that Dazai was clearly not doing great. It had been funny, but Dazai was clearly overwhelmed. That reaction was priceless. Chuya just muttered quietly, and Dazai huffed, crossing his arms. Dazai apparently then decided that the most reasonable thing he could do was sprawl out across Chuya as much as he could, laying across his legs and grabbing Chuya's arm, waving it about. Chuya sighed again, just letting Dazai move his arm how he wanted, wishing, not for the first time that day, that he could go back home and sleep for an eternity. Chuya relaxed and leaned back against the bookcase, taking a moment to just breathe. It was peaceful for a moment, but of course, nothing could stay that way. The next few events Chuya could have probably predicted. What he couldn't have predicted was the reaction they caused. First, Kunikida tried asking Dazai about his food again. "Dazai, now that your talent show is over, you should really eat something," Kunikida said, looking slightly concerned. Dazai had tensed up and gotten defensive. "I'm not hungry, Kunikida. I don't want to eat," he said, not moving from his place draped over Chuya's lap. Kunikida had been about to respond when someone on the other side of the bookcase Chuya and Dazai were sitting next to got knocked into it. As a result, when the person tried to catch themselves, they knocked a bunch of books off one of the shelves above Chuya and Dazai's heads. So a cascade of books fell around them, hitting the top of Chuya's head and the back of Dazai's. Chuya had felt instant pain where one of the books had hit him, followed quickly with another pain radiating across the back of his skull where another book must have hit him somehow. Dazai had gasped and almost screamed, surprised and hurt by the sudden pain, his hand going straight to the back of his head to protect it. Chuya's response was to get angry, forgetting Dazai, who had moved off of him by now, and standing up to yell at the people who had caused the books to fall on them. His shouting drew the attention of multiple people who stood around, watching like it was a TV show. The next thing he knew, it wasn't him shouting anymore. "Shut the fuck up!" Dazai screamed from where he sat on the floor. Dazai, who was still holding on to the back of his head, so covering one ear with his free hand and trying in vain to cover the other with his arm. Dazai, who looked about 2 seconds away from bursting into tears like a small child. "It's too loud," he continued, and Rampo, who had also covered his ears, nodded in agreement. Chuya felt bad instantly, but quickly Yosano picked up the slack and started to encourage everyone up. "Let's go see if the art room is empty. It'll be quieter there, and nobody will get attacked by books," she said, so everyone began to grab their things as the atmosphere in the library shifted back the way it was, just slightly more tension in the air. Dazai hadn't moved his hand from his head, and Kunikida, who unfortunately seemed to always have the best intentions at the worst of times, had kneeled down next to him and put a hand on his shoulder to ask what was wrong. Dazai had slapped the hand away, snapping. "Don't touch me!" Dazai hissed, clearly upset, more than most of them had seen. When slapping Kunikida's hand away, Dazai had moved the hand from his head, revealing the blood on his palm. Chuya wasn't the only one who noticed, and Yosano moved forward quickly, mostly ignoring the slightly hurt-looking Kunikida. "Dazai, your head! I didn't think the books would be enough to make you bleed. We need to get to the nurse's office." Yosano decided quickly, but Dazai shook his head, blinking rapidly and wiping his eyes. "No, I'm fine, just..." Dazai said, reaching to grab his bag as he stood up. Then, the straw that broke the camel's back. Or the event that broke Dazai's facade. When Dazai grabbed his bag, the same brown messenger bag he'd been using since the first year, that had been his older brother's before it had been his, the strap broke, and he dropped the bag in surprise, his stuff spilling all over the floor. It was silent for a few seconds, everyone watching Dazai as he just stared at the bag on the floor, and at the jotters that had fallen out, pencils and random pieces of paper he had drawn on, all over the floor. It seemed to take Dazai a few seconds to process what had happened. When he did, Chuya could see the change in his demeanor. Instead of shutting down like he normally would, instead of getting upset or crying like a normal 15-year-old might do, Dazai got angry. "Fuck this shit!" Dazai shouted, throwing his hands in the air. Dazai was a lot of things. He got annoyed, he got bitter. Of course he did. He never got angry. There was stunned silence for a few seconds longer, and then, quiet enough that only Chuya was able to pick it up, there was the first shaky breath. And then Dazai abandoned his bag, making a break for it and pushing past Atsushi, heading for the library exit. Chuya wasted no time, quickly following, trusting that someone else would gather up Dazai's stuff and keep an eye on his. Nobody protested them leaving or followed. Chuya followed Dazai all the way from the library to, of course, the bathroom on the top floor. It was empty as usual when Dazai flung open the door, and Chuya watched as Dazai just started pacing the length of the room, shaking his hands out next to him. It had been years since Julia had seen Dazai in a state like this, so overwhelmed and upset that he seemed to just stop working. The same thing happened to him sometimes, and there was nothing he knew to help. He didn't have any use here. There was nothing he could do. He could only watch in dread as Dazai continued pacing, his breathing fast and erratic. Dazai's shaky breath was interrupted with a sob, and Chuya realized with horror that Dazai was crying. One sob became two, and then it seemed uncontrollable, and Dazai stopped pacing, just bringing his hands to his face and smearing blood and tears across it, as he just stood sobbing in the middle of the mostly empty bathroom, his crying echoing off the walls. Chuya stood and stared, eyes wide as he stayed rooted to the ground, terrified. He didn't know what to do. Dazai was infallible. Nothing upset Dazai. He was fine. He was perfect. He was smart and happy and funny, and he had weird moments and wouldn't eat sometimes and made awkward comments about things that made certain alarm bells ring, but nothing upsets him. He doesn't cry, at least not sickening, gut-wrenching sobbing like he's doing now. Sure, he cries dramatically when Chuya has eaten the last of the strawberry-flavored sweets, or during Titanic, or stupid rom-coms. This isn't right. What was he supposed to do? There should be a rule book or a guideline, because Dazai's still crying, and Dazai obviously knows Chuya's there because Chuya hadn't been discreet in the way he was walking hurriedly behind him. Then Dazai moved and leaned against the wall, slumping down to sit on the floor and pulling his knees into his chest, crossing his arms and burying his face in them, his crying now muffled. Hesitantly, unsure what he should be doing, Chuya walked over and sat next to Dazai, mirroring his position, just sitting next to him quietly. After a few moments of the only sound being Dazai's continued crying, Dazai moved and Chuya opened his arms, letting Dazai move to practically be sitting on him, Dazai's face awkwardly pressed against Chuya's chest. As he did so, Chuya got a weird sense of deja vu, like something similar had happened, only the roles had been reversed. He couldn't remember it exactly, but he was sure he could remember something similar. New Year's Eve in a cold and snowy winter. Chuya just held Dazai tightly, not caring as Dazai's tears soaked through his school shirt, or about the way Dazai was shaking violently. He sat there for a few minutes, until Dazai wasn't crying quite the way he had been before, just sniffling and taking shaky breaths occasionally. "Do you want to talk about it?" Chuya asked cautiously, trying to keep his voice quiet. Dazai shook his head instantly, but stayed pressed into Chuya. Chuya took a deep breath, closing his eyes. He was so confused and upset. So much was happening, all the time. He didn't know how to process any of it. Apparently, neither did Dazai. After a moment, Chuya let go of Dazai, and Dazai sat up, leaning back against the wall again and breathing slowly, avoiding looking at Chuya. Chuya stood up and got a few paper towels, lightly wetting them, and he sat in front of Dazai. Carefully, he wiped Dazai's tears away with his thumbs, feeling Dazai's cold skin below his warm hands, looking at the contrast between his flushed cheeks and pale face, at his bleeding lip from being bitten too hard, at his tired and watery eyes, and the hair falling everywhere across his face. He then took the paper towel and wiped the dried blood Dazai had managed to smear over his right cheek when trying to wipe his own tears, being careful and mindful of not getting his face too wet. He wasn't used to this, trying to be so careful, purposely choosing to be soft with his movements, making an effort not to alarm or overwhelm someone. It was oddly nice, trying to care for someone. If it was anyone other than Dazai, in all honesty, he wouldn't be trying this hard. Maybe if it was one of his sisters. Once the blood was gone from Dazai's cheek, he brought the paper towel to Dazai's lips, finding a clean corner and grazing it over where Dazai's lip was bleeding from. Without realizing, the thumb from his other hand had migrated to sit just below the corner of Dazai's mouth. He swallowed thickly, his face warm as he looked at Dazai's lips. He had already realized his revelation the night before had been a fluke. He definitely didn't like the dumbass who started juggling in the middle of a library. But surely, he'd only kissed a few guys before. Even if he didn't like Dazai, it was probably normal to think about kissing him. Totally normal. He brushed his thumb against the bottom of Dazai's lips. They felt surprisingly soft to the touch. Dazai parted them, and Chuya looked up to meet his gaze, realizing Dazai had been watching him the entire time. He quickly cleared his throat and looked back at the cut on Dazai's lip, wiping away the last of the blood. Cuts on the lips healed quickly. It would stop bleeding soon. Chuya then pulled away, standing up. "Turn around," he instructed, his voice sounding oddly hoarse. "Let me see your head." Dazai tensed but obliged, turning so Chuya could see the back of his head. By now it had stopped bleeding, but there was blood clumped in the roots of Dazai's hair, and he wasn't going to let Dazai walk around for the rest of the day like that. So Chuya took the other paper towel and gently began cleaning the cut, the dried blood coming away easily. Coincidentally, the cut seemed to be in the same place Chuya's head had been hurting the past few days. As Chuya inspected the cut, he frowned. That didn't look like it was caused by a book. It looked like it had already been there and reopened. "Dazai?" Chuya asked cautiously, and Dazai moved his head as a way to urge Chuya to continue, seemingly not very keen on speaking. "What happened to your head? There's no way this was caused by a book," Chuya said, almost done cleaning away the blood, but lingering as he waited for an answer. It took Dazai a moment to respond, whether because he was thinking or because he was struggling to speak. Chuya didn't know. "I fell off my bed. Hit it off the bottom drawer next to my bed." Dazai responded quietly, picking at his bandages poking out the sleeve of his hoodie. Chuya didn't respond, just looking at the wound. He felt uncomfortable, something in his gut telling him something that he recognized and only now could put into words. He didn't believe Dazai. He was lying. Why? Chuya didn't know, but something was wrong and he was sure of it. He felt goosebumps on his skin as he finished cleaning the blood. Maybe he was wrong. He hoped he was wrong. Chuya wasn't investigative. He was curious and he was nosy, but he didn't go digging for things unless Dazai was by his side. How was he supposed to figure out what was going on? More importantly, maybe he was as oblivious as Rampo had said he was. Dazai was quick to get up when Chuya went to go put the paper towels in the bin. Chuya watched as Dazai took a breath and messed up his hair from the way Chuya had parted it to clean it, and he rubbed his eyes. He looked like he had done this 1,000 times. "Right, we need to track down where the rest of your little detective agency went," Dazai said, looking at himself in the mirror and washing the last of the blood from his hands. Chuya raised an eyebrow at the way Dazai referred to his friends as Chuyas. They had been Dazai's first. He was also slightly surprised by the sudden turnaround, but he didn't comment on it, just nodding. "All right," he agreed, nodding. Dazai sighed dramatically, and they left the bathroom. "God, I look horrifying now. I look like I was crying. This is so stupid," Dazai whined as they began walking. "My glasses are in my bag. I'll have to put them on so I don't look quite as ugly," Dazai said with a wrinkled nose. Chuya wanted to disagree, say that Dazai looked perfectly fine, if not extremely pretty, but he didn't. Instead, the glasses comment caught his attention. "Your glasses? I thought you didn't need those anymore." Dazai had gotten glasses a few years ago, something about severe vision impairment in his right eye, but Dazai rarely wore his glasses after a year. Chuya never sees him in them nowadays. "I do, but they're boring and make the colors duller," Dazai said dismissively, waving his hand. "They make colors dimmer?" Chuya asked dryly. He couldn't believe that was why Dazai wouldn't wear them. "And if I wore my glasses, my main Kanekida insult would be gone. I'd be insulting myself," Dazai wailed dramatically. Julia scoffed as they entered the home economics corridor. That's hardly a reason. You look good with glasses on. Dazai stopped in his tracks. Julia kept walking, speeding up as his face burned. He did not think Dazai was attractive. He did not think Dazai was attractive. He did not think Dazai was attractive. He slowed to a stop and spared a glance at Dazai, whose cheeks were flushed and his mouth was slightly open. Okay, maybe Dazai was a little attractive. He can appreciate a man's objective attractiveness without being attracted to him. Chuya thinks I'm pretty? Dazai said slowly, a grin creeping onto his face. I did not say that, Chuya protested, his face red. I said I liked your glasses, not that you're pretty. Dazai practically skipped along to Chuya. Yeah, you did. You said I look good with my glasses on. That does not equate to pretty. Yes, it does. No, it doesn't. You were thinking it. Somehow, Chuya ended up with a fist in front of Dazai's jumper, pulling him down to glare at him, wanting to wipe that smug expression off his face. And maybe their bickering was interrupted by Atsushi. I thought I heard you guys, Atsushi said happily, though he stopped abruptly when he saw how close Chuya and Dazai were to each other. Am I interrupting something? He asked, backing away. Chuya and Dazai exchanged glances. No, Chuya said firmly. Yes, Dazai said smugly. Chuya yanked Dazai again, and Dazai just grinned, hands in pockets as he prepared to say something. We're in this classroom here, Atsushi said quickly, sounding almost scared, like he thought they might start trying killing each other in the corridor. Begrudgingly, Chuya let go of Dazai, waiting for Dazai to walk ahead of him before he took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. Last night's revelation was a fluke. He does not like Dazai. Then he followed Dazai into the room, blinking in surprise. Dazai was standing and staring at his bag, sitting on one of the tables, the strap fixed, sewn back on where it had come off. Yosono smiled and cleared her throat. Kunikida can sew, apparently, and I know how to do stitches. Kunikida sewed the side that came off, and I fixed the stitching on the other side where the same problem was going to end up happening. Chuya stepped forward so he can see the back for himself. It was clear which side had been done by Kunikida, neat and pretty stitches attaching the strap back in place. Next to it, where Kunikida must have finished, there was a basic, single star that he must have added. The stitches on the other side were slightly less even and messy, but they were still practiced and looked strong. They didn't go all the way across, just where the strap had been fraying. I was the one who put all your stuff back where it was, Rampo called from a few seats away. I found the supplies, Akutagawa said, looking for acknowledgement for his part to play in the repair. I was the one who got permission to use them, Atsushi chimed in. Dazai was very quiet. He reached into his bag, finding his glasses and putting them on. Then he turned back to Chuya, trying to discreetly wipe his eyes, like he had been about to cry again. Thank you, Dazai said quietly, just loud enough to be heard. Chuya felt his heart might shatter. He wondered if Dazai seemed to realize how much everyone in the room loved him. Your detective agency, Dazai had called it, in reference to them being Chuya's friends, as though they weren't his own. Chuya wished he could hammer it into Dazai's skull how appreciated he was. With a sudden switch of energy, Dazai turned back to the room. I have no idea how you wear glasses all the time, Kunikida. I can actually see things, and let me tell you, I am horrified. Chuya rolled his eyes and smiled. Walking home from school was usually rather boring. It was headphones on, hand in hand, both trying not to fall asleep on their feet, or preparing for some daring adventure they'd planned. Daring adventures had been less frequent recently, exams and weather making it challenging, but Chuya didn't mind it as much as he thought he would have. Sharing earbuds while listening to Taylor Swift on the walk home, the rain coming down gently, and the hands firmly locked together, he didn't mind that they wouldn't go to do something crazy or stupid. He was actually in favor of going home and having a long nap. He's sure Dazai wouldn't mind. As they got home, Chuya went to walk to the door, and Dazai dropped his hand. Chuya stopped, blinking and looking down. Dazai handed the earbud back. "I'm going back to Mori's house," Dazai said, a smile set on his face. Chuya frowned and felt slightly sick. "You always come over after school, especially on Fridays. Are you coming tomorrow?" he asked instead. Dazai cleared his throat and he looked away, rocking back and forth on his feet. "No, actually, Mori is taking me to a medical conference thing to prepare me for when I go to uni and to make connections in the medical field," he said. Dazai explained, looking back at Chuya. Chuya just nodded. He wasn't sure what to say. "Where is it?" he ended up asking, oblivious to his older sister standing in the doorway. "I'm not sure. I didn't pay much attention. We have to travel for quite a while to get there, though," Dazai said, sighing. "When will you be back?" Chuya asked, surprised by the emotion in his own voice. "I should be back on Monday. I'll be at school, I promise," Dazai said, nodding his head. Chuya just looked at Dazai, his eyebrows furrowed. This was the first time Dazai had mentioned his medical thing, though they did have their fallout. It might have been decided during then, or maybe Dazai had been hoping to get out of going somehow. "Okay," Chuya said, nodding back. His throat felt tight. It was barely 3 days, Friday evening, Saturday, Sunday, and he'll be back Monday morning. That's barely any time at all. "Chuya, it's raining, get inside," Koyu called, and Chuya's dad appeared behind her. "You'll catch a cold." "Oh, hey, Dazai." Chuya's dad chimed in with a wave. Dazai waved back with a smile. Chuya was going to roll his eyes and make a joke about his parents liking Dazai as much as they liked their own children, when he realized something. "Are you walking home?" Chuya asked, feeling it as the rain picked up again and was seeping through his hoodie. Dazai nodded. "How else would I get home? Mori's working." "And Oda lives in another city," Chuya added, sighing. Dazai winced, but Chuya didn't notice, instead frowning. "Do you even have a raincoat?" Chuya asked. He didn't think he'd seen Dazai wear a waterproof jacket for years. Dazai shook his head, crossing his arms, looking a little uncomfortable. Of course he'd be uncomfortable. It was wet, cold, and Dazai's bandages were going to end up soaked right against his skin. Surely that was the last thing Dazai needed after the day he'd had. "Wait here," Chuya demanded. He turned and ran into the house, running through the house and up the stairs without taking his shoes off. "Oi, shoes!" Chuya's mom shouted from the kitchen, but Chuya was already in his room. He threw his bag down and turned the light on, going to his wardrobe. Leaning down to the bottom, he rifled through the pile of hoodies and jackets he had. He found what he was looking for quickly, a black waterproof jacket that he had gotten during the winter that ended up being too big for him. With it fell out a hoodie in a similar brown to Dazai's back, another piece of clothing too big for him. Making a split-second decision, Chuya grabbed a jumper as well, and he raced back down the stairs. He found Dazai standing in the kitchen with Koyo roughly attacking Dazai's drenched hair with a towel, because of course Dazai had been walking in with his hood down for most of the walk, and by the time he put it up, it was too late. "Careful, his head is hurt," Chuya warned, slipping his shoes off sheepishly as his mother glared at him from across the kitchen. Koyo's eyes narrowed instantly. "Excuse me?" she asked, and Dazai spoke hurriedly. "It's nothing. It had healed fine, but a book fell on my head today and it reopened. It's nothing to worry about," Dazai explained, smiling and then yelping when Koyo sighed in annoyance and then continued her attack on Dazai's wet hair, albeit gentler than before. Chuya's dad frowned from where he was helping his mom cook. "If you got hit on the head and managed to reopen a wound with the force, you probably shouldn't be walking home, especially not in this weather." Dazai shrugged, and Koyo left the towel on Dazai's head as she seemed to decide that now Chuya was here, it was his job to fuss over Dazai. "I've walked in worse," Dazai said, but he gladly took the clothes from Chuya, pulling the towel off his head and throwing it at Chuya. "That's not the point," Chuya responded, catching the towel and crossing his arms, watching as Dazai took off his wet hoodie and put the brown one on instead. Dazai stuck his tongue out at Chuya childishly and pulled on the jacket. "I'll be fine. I have my phone, so if there's any problems I can call," Dazai said, tilting his head and smiling. "I like walking. It'll be okay." Nobody seemed particularly happy about it, but Chuya agreed hesitantly. "Okay then, just message me when you get home, yeah?" Dazai nodded, sticking out 2 thumbs up. "Whatever you say, boss," he said, grinning. Then he lowered his voice, stage whispering. "Did you like my impression of you? You would say something like that. Loser." Dazai then smiled and picked his bag up from where he had put it down. "Bye," Dazai said, waving and leaving the house before Chuya could even argue. Dazai had left his damp jumper sitting over the back of a chair, and Chuya sighed, picking it up and draping it over the radiator to dry. As he stood in the kitchen, looking at the towel in his hands Dazai had thrown at him, he frowned. Dazai had been all over the place today. He felt bad, standing in his happy, warm, and safe kitchen, while Dazai was walking home in the cold rain. As he stared at the towel, a memory flashed to the front of his mind. "One of my friends lives on Dazai Street. There's a little rumor that his dad hits him. She caught it through a window, apparently. Maybe that's the reason he dresses like some kind of neglected orphan, because his dad hates him and his mom left him." Something uncomfortable and heavy took root in his chest. That wasn't true. It couldn't be. It wasn't. But what had happened to Dazai's mom? Did Dazai even know? Why had he not been to Dazai's house in so long? He had thousands of questions and no answers. This felt so stupid. It all started with wanting to find his soulmate, wanting to know who was supposed to know him best. Which seems impossible. Nobody could know him better than Dazai. But now he had so many other problems, and he didn't know where to start. His thoughts were interrupted by his mom putting a hand on his shoulder. "You worry about that boy too much. He'll be fine," she said, giving Chuya a hug and kissing the top of his head. Chuya smiled a little, extremely thankful for his mom. He didn't know what he'd do if he didn't have his mother or his father. He never actually considered how Dazai must feel watching him interact with his parents when his own weren't there. Still, Chuya nodded and sighed. "Yeah, he'll be fine." Chuya agreed quietly, wishing he believed it. Yippee! Nikolai mentioned. Also, Chuya, you hopeless romantic, please gain some brain cells, we're all begging. Gosh, I felt so bad for Dazai in this chapter. I think we all had those moments where we're already way over the edge and even the smallest things tip us off. Imagine a collection of that right after losing someone dear. And Chuya's comment about Oda, yeah, heartbreaking. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. Don't forget to send kudos to the author through the link in the description. Also, if you'd like to request any fics, YouTube community tabs are now open for you to post, aside from Tumblr. And if you'd like to show more support, I'm available on Ko-fi and Super Thanks is now available. Hope you have a great week. Till next time.